The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the most consequential event in human history. And that makes it controversial, not because it didn't happen, but because if it did happen, then everything that Jesus said during his life and ministry has been vindicated. He himself has been vindicated. And that's what makes his resurrection controversial. Because if it happened, then people are forced to deal with the weightiness of who he is, of who he claimed to be, which is why today, on That You May Know Him, we are going to present the case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm going to show you some of the historical proofs that collectively make a very strong case for Jesus's resurrection. For the fact that whether people are Christian or non-Christian, secular or religious, they need to see, everybody on this earth, on this planet, needs to consider and strongly weigh the claims of Jesus Christ. I'm not just going to show you the historical proofs. It's my goal today to demonstrate for you how to defend the resurrection of Jesus, and to do it in less than 15 minutes. Are you ready for this? Let's go. I hope this episode increases your faith and equips you to defend it. Now, there are two historical certainties that must be understood before we can speak about proving the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. These are not debated. They are generally accepted even by the most ardent skeptics in the historical and scholarly world. They're accepted as facts. The first one is that Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah and predicted his own death and resurrection. At his trial, Jesus was asked verbatim by Caiaphas, the high priest that year, "Are you the Christ?" That means, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And to this question, Jesus replied with an emphatic affirmative statement. He said, essentially, "Yes, I am." And then he quoted a passage from the prophet Daniel. And he told them, "Soon enough, you will see me, the Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of Almighty God, of the Ancient of Days." That was an emphatic statement that Jesus was making publicly, that he was not only the Messiah of Israel, he was the Son of God. Before that, just after the transfiguration experience with Peter, James, and John, Jesus told his three closest followers that he would die and be raised from the dead. This is what it says in Matthew 17. "And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.'" That's just one example of Jesus predicting his own death and resurrection. He also proclaimed himself to be the greatest of all the prophets. In fact, greater than all the prophets. In Matthew 12, verse 41, Jesus told the religious leaders he was speaking to, he spoke these words to them: "The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here." This is aside from the fact that Jesus claimed to exist before Abraham. Not only was he greater than Abraham, he pre-existed Abraham. In John 8:58, Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," which is the precise moment that the crowds in Jerusalem picked up stones to stone him to death. So Jesus not only believed himself to be the Messiah, he also claimed to be the divine Son of God and predicted his own death and his resurrection. Number two, the evidence for the death of Jesus. There is almost no dispute among scholars and historians that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Romans somewhere around 33 AD. There's a few different estimates in terms of the year. Could have been the year 30 AD, could have been the year 33 AD, but right in those couple of years, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. He was killed by crucifixion by the Romans in Jerusalem. The atheist scholar 𝗭𝗪𝙧, who studied the resurrection from a historical perspective, said this: Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. That's an atheist scholar who studied the resurrection. He says that from a historical perspective, Jesus' death by crucifixion is indisputable. In other words, it happened. This is a historical fact that Jesus died. Here's a partial list of early non-Christian sources that confirm Jesus' death by crucifixion. Mara bar Serapion, a non-Christian, non-Jewish writer in AD 73. Josephus, a non-Christian Jewish historian who wrote his Antiquities around AD 93, the Antiquities of the Jews. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing in the early 2nd century. Lucian, a satirist writing in the 2nd century. Celsus, a Greek philosopher, an early opponent of Christianity, writing in the 2nd century. These are all non-Christian writers who affirm that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion in either the first, they're writing in either the 1st or 2nd century. And finally, the Babylonian Talmud, i.e. the Jewish Talmud, which was written between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD, claims that Jesus died by hanging, which by that it means by being hung on the eve of Passover, somewhere around 33 AD. So these are two historical certainties that we must establish if we're going to then talk about the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. The first is that Jesus believed himself to be the Messiah and the Son of God and predicted his own death and resurrection. And the second is the evidence that Jesus of Nazareth did die by crucifixion in the 1st century AD. Now, with that, I want to give you 3 independently established facts supported by the historical evidence and agreed upon by the vast majority of historians and scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, that collectively present a pretty compelling case for the historical resurrection of Jesus from the dead. This is the evidence. These are 3 big pieces of evidence that when you put them all together, the case for Jesus' literal bodily resurrection is pretty strong, regardless of what your worldview is. Number 1, the empty tomb. The empty tomb was witnessed by believers and non-believers alike, both Jews and Romans, and of course, the earliest followers of Jesus who were all themselves Jewish. Even the opponents of Jesus admitted that his tomb was empty. Matthew 28, starting in verse 11. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Why would the religious leaders in Jerusalem, the Jewish religious leaders who were responsible for taking Jesus to Pilate and demanding that he be crucified, why would they say something like, his disciples have come and stolen his body? Because they knew and were publicly acknowledging that the tomb was empty. They were publicly acknowledging that the tomb was empty. And because it was empty, they made up a lie. And they told the Roman guards who had been guarding the tomb to repeat this lie if ever they were asked about the empty tomb. But the point is that everyone, Roman soldiers, members of the Sanhedrin, all of them acknowledged that the tomb was empty. Number 2, the discovery of the empty tomb by women. According to all 4 gospel records, the empty tomb was first discovered by the female followers of Jesus. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to us, but to a 1st century reader of the Gospels, including this fact in their retelling of these events would have been counterproductive. Unless, of course, it were actually true. You see, women's testimony was not admissible in a Jewish or Roman court in the 1st century. Women were looked down upon and were not considered reliable witnesses in any official legal sense. If the gospel writers were inventing or embellishing any part of this story, this would have been the first fact that they changed. However, the fact of the matter is that all four gospel writers acknowledge that women were the first to discover the empty tomb. And this is strong evidence that the gospel writers were not embellishing. They were reporting the facts of the story that they believed to be true. Some scholars call this the criterion of embarrassment. When an ancient writer includes something that in that day and time would have been considered embarrassing in one of their retellings of historical events, it adds credence to the events themselves. Because why would someone, if they were embellishing or coming up with a story, add facts voluntarily that were embarrassing or that took credibility away from the story that they were telling? Number 3, the eyewitness accounts and the martyrdom of the apostles and the early followers of Jesus. According to the Apostle Paul, in the 40 days between Jesus's resurrection and ascension, over 500 individuals witnessed the resurrected Christ after he had been crucified by the Romans. And you can find this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. First, he appeared to Mary Magdalene, then to the other women amongst his disciples. Then he appeared to 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, Cleopas and another unnamed disciple, then to Peter, then to the 11 apostles. Then he appeared to over 500 people at one time, then to his brother James, who became a faithful follower of Jesus after that, then to a large group of apostles, and lastly, to Saul of Tarsus, aka the Apostle Paul. Now, skeptics might say to themselves, how do we know these people were telling the truth? All these people in the first century that claimed to see Jesus alive after he was crucified by the Romans. What's amazing about this is not that so many people claim to see him. It's that all of them were willing to die for the claim that he had been raised from the dead. 10 out of 11 of Jesus's original 12 apostles died by martyrdom in the first century. The only 2 that didn't were Judas, who had committed suicide years earlier after betraying Jesus, and John, the apostle and the writer of the 4th gospel, who lived to an old age, but who suffered a tremendous amount of persecution as a result of being a follower and early preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. A group of men, a group of people who had been hiding in fear in the days following Jesus' death were now, in the ensuing years, openly proclaiming, boldly proclaiming in the city where Jesus was killed that he was alive. They were convinced of this fact to the point that they were willing to be killed. They were willing to give their lives for the fact that Christ had been raised from the dead. That same atheist scholar I mentioned earlier, 𝗫𝙤𝙤𝙬, wrote about the resurrection appearances, and he said this: it can be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. He is not alone in making this statement. Many atheist and agnostic scholars have come to the exact same conclusion. You can look them up. Another famous one that many people know of is Bart Ehrman, who's an agnostic historian of the New Testament, but he believes that the earliest followers of Jesus genuinely believed that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. He just doesn't believe that Jesus actually got up from the dead. But the evidence points to the fact that a large group of people in the first century saw Jesus raised because they were willing to die for that claim. And nobody dies for a claim that they do not believe to be true. So let's summarize the evidence. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and predicted his own death and resurrection. He actually died by Roman crucifixion in the first century. These are historical facts that are undebatable. His tomb was found empty and was believed and known to be empty by the Jewish religious leaders who were responsible for taking him to Pilate and demanding that he be crucified, by the Roman soldiers that had been guarding his tomb, and by his followers. It was well known in Jerusalem in the year 33 AD that the tomb that Jesus had been buried in, a well-known tomb that was owned by a wealthy, influential individual named Joseph of Arimathea, was empty. Next, we have the fact that the tomb was discovered by women, a fact that in the first century would not have given credence to this story, but the gospel writers reported the truth, not what they believed would add credence to their story. And lastly, of course, we have the eyewitnesses of Jesus, the people who encountered him after he had been raised from the dead, who all were willing, and many of whom did die for their belief and for their certainty that Jesus had been resurrected. When you put all this together, it makes a pretty strong case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And this is what has caused many agnostic and atheistic scholars to acknowledge the fact that something happened in the first century that caused all these disciples to run around saying Jesus had been raised from the dead. Many of those same people who study this from a historical perspective have come to faith in Jesus and have themselves acknowledged that the only plausible, realistic conclusion is that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that everything that he said about himself during his life and ministry, therefore, must be true. There's one other thing I need to mention. We now have a historical artifact called the Shroud of Turin. And the more that artifact has been studied over the years, the more it seems to be yet another piece of evidence that Jesus Christ died by Roman crucifixion in the first century, was buried in a tomb, and was then raised from the dead. If you want to know more about that artifact, there's going to be a video that pops up right here in just a couple of seconds. Until next time, stay blessed. Thanks for watching. My name is Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.